Welcome. My name is Linda Williams. I am a community outreach and training manager with Consumer Action, coming to you live from Fontana, California. I am so happy that you took time out of your day to join us for today's webinar. Before we get into the featured presentations, I need to go over a few housekeeping items, introduce you to Consumer Action, and review the agenda. But first, I need to thank our sponsor. Today's webinar is part of Consumer Action's COVID-19 education project with funding provided by Wells Fargo. And here with us today is Bonnie Wallace from Wells Fargo, and she would like to welcome you to the webinar as well. You're on, Ms. Wallace.
Well, thank you so much. And again, welcome to the Rise of Fraud and ID Theft in the COVID-19 Era webinar. I'm Bonnie Wallace, and I'm with the Wells Fargo Foundation, a longtime supporter of consumer action. As millions of Americans face continued financial hardships due to the pandemic, Wells Fargo is working hard to keep families in their homes, getting relief to small businesses, helping people of color and LMI communities navigate financial stability challenges, creating pathways to economic advancement, and increasing financial inclusion. We're very pleased to collaborate with Consumer Action to provide information and resources to practitioners who are addressing the needs of some of the most financially vulnerable and are fostering an inclusive recovery from COVID-19. Today's webinar is addressing a long-time problem that has gained both momentum and strength amidst the challenges and chaos of a global pandemic, and that's the problem of fraud and identity theft. As our nation continues to struggle through the challenges of a pandemic, fraudsters and identity thieves are exploiting the crisis by targeting consumers as they seek information, resources, financial relief, housing assistance, and treatment for COVID-19. So on behalf of Wells Fargo and Consumer Action, I want to thank you for the work you're doing on the front line to protect some of the most vulnerable members of our communities and to enable financial inclusion for all. And I'm excited that I do have a colleague today participating in this. And while the topic is a difficult one, I think that we'll all gain some very valuable information today. Thank you.
Thank you, Ms. Wallace. As the announcer stated, when you join the webinar, you are in listen-only mode. However, if you have any questions during the presentations, and we hope you will have a time, please type your questions to the box on the control panel. My colleague, Nelson Santiago, will facilitate the question and answer segment that will follow the presentation, so he will be capturing your questions and he will present them to our guest speaker. Now, if you're on Twitter, you can use that platform to ask your questions. Consumer Action's handle is @ConsumerAction, or you can use our go-to hashtag CA Webinars. Now, the webinar is being recorded and it will be available to you tomorrow afternoon at the latest, along with handouts and the PowerPoint slides and the link to the recording. At the end of the webinar, you will receive a survey. Please, please, please complete the survey before signing off the webinar. Now, let me introduce you to that great agency that I work for, Consumer Action. So what do we do at Consumer Action? As it says on the screen under Welcome to Consumer Action, through education and advocacy, we fight for strong consumer rights and policies for all consumers, but especially underrepresented consumers nationwide. How? We advance consumer rights nationwide by referring complaints through our national hotline, by publishing education materials in multiple languages, and through our monthly newsletter, The Insider and Scamgram. Our quarterly publication, CA News, is also a good way that we reach consumers, and by advocating for consumers in the media and before lawmakers. So since quite a few of you are new to Consumer Action, I thought I would take a few seconds just to show you how you can download our free materials from the website. Our address is there at the bottom of the screen. So let's say you are interested in our COVID-19 education project. Once you're on our website, click on the dark green bar and you will land on our COVID-19 project page. When you're on the page, if you click on the words resource guides, you will find valuable resources for consumers impacted by COVID-19, and they're in multiple languages. Now, displayed on the screen is, and hot off the press, is our latest fact sheet on identity theft. When the webinar is over, please, please, please go to our website and download a copy of the fact sheet. I promise you will not be disappointed. Now, if you're interested in more fact sheets that we created, click on the word fact sheets. and you will find other topics, including fair housing rights, estate planning, making the job transition, and a lot more topics. Now, we are a 501c3 organization. We're supported by membership, donations, and grants. So at the end of the webinar, there will be information about how you can make a donation to Consumer Action. So let's take a quick look at the agenda so you'll know what to expect today. At Consumer Action, we believe in making learning fun, so we open every training by testing your knowledge on the topic of the training with our most popular game, How Much Do You Know? So today we have 4 true and false poll questions related to fraud and identity theft. Following the game, I will introduce you to our 2 dynamic guest speakers. A question and answer session led by Nelson Santiago will follow. I will come back and tell you how you can donate to Consumer Action, and I'll wrap up. So let the games begin. Please launch our first poll question. Okay, the tax transcript scam is hurled by an attachment labeled tax account transcript, but it actually contains malware or ransomware. Is that true or is that false? So there's a tax transcript scam that's out there, and it's hurled by an attachment labeled tax account transcript, but it's not a transcript, it's malware or ransomware. Could that be true or is that false? Okay, come on. Don't overthink it. Don't overthink it. Okay, let's close the poll. Let's see the results. Okay, 87% of you think that's true. 13% think it's false. Well, if you said false, you are incorrect. That's absolutely true. According to the IRS, these emails are the work of identity thieves and tax scammers who are trying to trick you into handing over your password or your verifying PII. The attachments will not include a tax transcript. In fact, they will include malware or ransomware. Okay, let's launch the second question. Okay, if you received a claim form from your state's unemployment insurance office, but you didn't file a claim for unemployment, you should report the fraud. You should report the suspected fraud. Is that true or is that false? If you receive a claim form from your state's unemployment insurance office, but you didn't file a claim, you should report the suspected fraud. Is that true or false? Don't overthink it. Okay, let's see the results. 98% of you think it's true. 2% think it's false. That's actually true. And a list of state fraud hotlines where you can report the fraud will be included in the resources that you will receive by Dropbox tomorrow. So that is true. So make sure you let your clients know about that. Let's go to the next question. Posting a photo of your vaccination card on social media can be an invitation to identity theft. What? I can't tell the world I'm fully vaccinated? Posting a photo of your vaccination card on social media can be an invitation to identity theft. Is that true or is that false? Don't overthink it. Okay, close the poll. Let's see the results. 95% of you think it's true, 5% think it's false. That's actually true. According to the FTC, and that fact sheet came out about a couple of months ago. According to the FTC, your vaccination card has sensitive information on it, which could include your full name, birth date, where you got your vaccine, the date you got it. And when you post it on Facebook, Instagram, or other social media platforms, you can be handing over valuable information to someone who can use it against you. Let's go to the last question. Scammers are trying to get the PII, personal identifiable information of consumers who are facing eviction by posing as rental assistance agency. No one could be that mean. That just can't be true. Is this true or is this false? Scammers are trying to get the PII, personal identifiable information of consumers who are facing eviction by posing as rental assistance agencies. Is this true or is this false? Let's see the results. 100% of you think it's true. That is absolutely true. According to the FTC, scammers will call, email, text, worry you to death, saying that you can get money for rent. These scammers will always tell you to give them money up front and hand over your personal information. This is one of the scams that's out there. So please, please, please pass this information on to your clients. Thank you for playing along with the game. Participating. I hope you enjoy playing along, but most of all, I hope you learn a new scam or two that you can let your community know about. Now I need you to break out your pen and paper. You may want to take a few notes, and let me introduce to you our dynamic guest speaker. Our first guest speaker is Eva Velasquez. She is the president, CEO at the Identity Theft Resource Center. Before taking on the role as president and CEO of the ID Theft Resource Center, she served as the vice president of operations for the San Diego Better Business Bureau, and she spent 21 years at San Diego District Attorney's Office. She is recognized as a nationwide expert. She's been featured on such outlets as CNBC Nightly Business Report, Huffington Post Live, Forbes, Bloomberg, and numerous other outlets. She is the driving force behind the first free ID theft help app and Identity Theft Resource Center new artificial intelligence victim chat box, Vivian. Vivian is currently in beta testing and will be released later this year. She is a published author and the recipient of the National Crime Victim Service Award from the Department of Justice and OVC and the National Consumer League's Florence Kelly Consumer Leadership Award. And guess what? You can follow her on Twitter as well. Now, our next dynamic speaker is Andy Collins. Andy is currently Wells Fargo Fraud and Claims Management, Industry Insight and Intelligence Executive in Fraud Prevention. Among his significant previous positions, Andy served as head of fraud risk operations at SunTrust Bank, which is an Atlanta, Georgia-based super-regional bank serving the eastern United States. Prior to SunTrust, he was deposit line executive for USAA Federal Savings Bank, which is dedicated to providing banking services to U.S. military and their families. He also led the checking product startup at Ally Bank, one of the country's first direct banks, doing its rebranding from GMAC. Prior to that, Andy spent most of his career at Bank of America, deploying enterprise-wide segmentation strategies, managing credit card portfolios and sales, and leading the Honshu region of Japan with Bank of America's overseas community bank stationed in Tokyo. He holds a Bachelor of Science degree from Liberty University, graduating with honors. We are honored to have both Eva and Andy here with us today. Now take out your pen and paper and get ready to be amazed as I turn this webinar over to our guest speakers. Take it away, Eva.
Thank you so much for that wonderful introduction. I'm so pleased to be here and so glad that you all took some time out of your schedules to join us today. Now that you know about me, and I am trying to get to the arrows here. There we go. Now that you know about me, let me just tell you a little bit about the ITRC. We are a 501c3 nonprofit organization. This is our mission statement. And in reality, how do we do this? We provide detection and prevention education, just like this webinar, but we also provide direct victim and consumer services, one-on-one through our contact center. This includes a toll-free number. You can live chat with us. You can text to chat with us. You can reach us through social media, through our free ID Theft Help app. We don't have smoke signal or carrier pigeons yet, but I'm working on it. Any way that you want to get in touch with us and get those free free one-on-one services, whether you are a victim and you need a remediation plan, or if you are a concerned consumer and you have questions. Maybe you've encountered a scam, you've received an email or received a message on social media. We will help you in that moment. And of course, everything is at no cost to consumers and victims. And here's what we'll discuss today. What do identity theft and those related crimes, what do they look like? So you can identify them if you encounter them or experiencing them. We'll talk about some of the trends, meaning what do the cyber criminals, what do they really want? And it's more than just your money. They want your data too. We'll talk about at the end, of course, how you can minimize your risk, and then we'll have some resources for all of you included at the end. And I know there's a great packet coming your way from Consumer Action, so keep an eye out for that. Just to do some level setting here, when we're talking about identity crimes and when we talk about identity theft, that is the misuse of your identity credentials. And a compromise is where they've just been exposed in some manner. So they could be exposed by a data breach, a data exposure. You can even self-expose. Maybe you have given that information away to someone who wasn't who they said they were, or via a phishing email or something like that. And then the misuse is when the identity theft actually occurs. And there are several different types of identity theft. We've got financial, medical, criminal, and government. And I just want to explain these briefly so you have a good foundation of what these things look like. Financial is far and away the most common type of identity theft, and that's where your information is misused to get financial goods or services, things like loans, a credit card, opening a bank account, etc. Medical identity theft, and that's where someone uses your information to get medical goods or services. And it's not just a hospital or doctor's visits. I mean, it could be at a dentist office, it could be for prescriptions, it can even be for things like durable medical equipment. Then there's criminal identity theft, where your information is misused during the commission of a crime, and that can range from anything from like a moving violation, like the speeding ticket, all the way up to a felony. It is the least common type of identity theft that we see and that we help remediate, but unfortunately it's one of the most complicated to unwind because you have to deal with whatever jurisdiction where it took place, and there are many, many different rules and processes in place. And then there's government identity theft. And this is where someone uses your information to apply for government benefits or services. And it really has been, there's been an explosion of government identity theft in the last year due to the pandemic. And we'll dig a little bit into that as we get further into the presentation. Let's talk about that PII that Linda was referencing earlier, that personally identifying information. This is how identity theft happens. Sometimes you sit back and wonder, how did this crime get committed? I don't understand how they pretended to be me. Well, it's really about your identity credentials. And I like to use the analogy of a puzzle. If you think about your identity as a puzzle of you, a puzzle picture of you, the more pieces that someone has, the more clear that picture is. So you can kind of think about those credentials as really being the core pieces of the puzzle. I do want to make a note that we include usernames and passwords in that. Please realize that usernames and passwords to online accounts really are part of your PII. They're part of your PII and a lot of the regulations, and just from a practical standpoint, they can be used to gain more information about you and simply to wreak havoc. So that's something that I do want folks to realize and remember. But let's talk about, if we think of it of that picture, let's talk about what those edges look like. And more other types of identity data are your biometrics and your behaviors or biometric behaviors. And you know, we've really normalized the use of facial recognition. Apple really did that with your thumbprint and facial recognition to open your phone, but there's much more to it. Anything that you are is considered a biometric. And then there's your behaviors. I know that this can be a little discombobulating for people. They don't like to think about the fact that all of their behaviors are being measured, but I'm telling you that they are. This data about you is being collected and measured. And it's not all bad. There are legitimate use cases for it, and we're going to be talking to Andy later, and he will be probably explaining what some of those legitimate uses are. And that is, look, if you've gotten that call from your bank saying, hey, we have this charge in Delaware. Are you putting, filling up at the gas station in Delaware? And you're going, no, I live in California. I'm not over there. That's not me. One of the ways that they are able to detect that fraud is they're looking for anomalous behaviors. And the only way they can identify what those anomalies are is by knowing what your spending behavior is. Where do you shop? How often? How much do you spend? Those are important things for fraud detection and prevention. So there are legitimate uses for it. Unfortunately, on the other side, when the thieves or the bad actors get that information, they can circumvent those fraud protections and more accurately impersonate you. And that is why it is lucrative and valuable to the thieves. So let's talk about some of those current trends and predictions now that you have a good foundation, now that you understand what PII really is, how broad it is, the different types of identity theft. This is data from the Federal Trade Commission. And it's really important to understand that both identity crimes and fraud have increased, but we didn't start at a baseline of zero. This has been an ongoing problem prior to the pandemic, but the pandemic contributed to the dramatic increase in both of these last year. Some of the factors that were influencing that increase for scams and fraud in general, it was just that there were so many opportunities presented for all these different types of scams, things that may not necessarily have been on our radar or been terribly lucrative for the thieves prior to the pandemic. Fake cleaning products, fake medical products like cures and tests and vaccines, things like disaster aid, and charity scams have always been around, but they tend to be localized wherever that disaster hit. And because the pandemic was global, we didn't really have a localized region that was more prone to those types of scams. It was the entire country. And then we had increases in government program scams, romance scams. So many people were isolated and lonely. And then, of course, the work from home scams. And that's in both the form of fake employment opportunities and more phishing emails coming into our newly established home workforce. And keep in mind when we're talking about scams that there are some common attributes in all of those scams. And I'm going to get into those in just a little bit deeper when we talk more about the scams. Now, this is data from the ITRC's data breach report, and it's one of the other factors that contributed to the fraud and ID theft landscape was the availability of identity credentials, that PII that we talked about earlier. Now, data breaches have been trending down over the last couple of years, and you can see that on the chart at the top. But please realize that even though they're on a downward trend, there were still 300 million individuals impacted by data breaches last year. So even though it's a downward trend, it is still a risk. And the process here and why this is just something that I want you to realize is data breaches do have a huge impact. And because there were so many previously over the years, a lot of that identity data about you was already available. And so the thieves had that data to leverage and create opportunities for themselves when the pandemic hit. That's the unfortunate reality of the landscape that we live in. And remember when I was saying that to keep in mind that your PII includes usernames and passwords, I really just want to reiterate that. That's something that I want folks to really understand and remember. Here's the value of those things that we don't necessarily think about. And look at that, a hacked Gmail account is worth a lot more than a credit card on the dark web. So it's important. I'm not saying that your credit card data isn't important. It still has value and it's something that you should protect, but please remember to protect those usernames and passwords from your account on all of your online accounts because they are super valuable. Now let's talk about some of the COVID related fraud that was really, really unique to COVID. Like I said before, a lot of these scams and frauds have been around. We didn't start at a baseline of 0, but here are two: unemployment identity theft and the stimulus fraud that were brand new to 2020 and things that we didn't have prior to the pandemic. You see the bottom chart, the stimulus fraud, and you can see that we have this big spike, the blue spike in those numbers, and that's when the first round of stimulus checks came out. And whenever you create a program where there's a lot of money put into it, the thieves will be attracted to it and they will try to leverage that. And this is ongoing because in 2021, in January, we have another big spike when the second round came out. And we are currently experiencing that in the call center right now with this newest round of stimulus funding. So this is something that, again, new to 2020 and appears to be ongoing. It has not ended yet. The real story, though, is the unemployment identity theft. And this is where a lot of those things that I just talked about really coalesced. To give you some context, again, this has been around for a long time. It's something that we have had to deal with, but it wasn't as lucrative. So in 2019, our call center took about 19 calls. We had 19 cases for this type of identity theft. In 2020, we had more than 900, and it's continuing into this year. We're already up to over 1,300, and the FTC saw this as well. And why did this happen? It's because of all those previous data breaches, all of those previous exposures, our data was out there, and the thieves found a great opportunity to leverage that data. It really was the perfect storm. Now, there were some things that consumers could do to minimize the risk, but unfortunately for this particular type of identity theft, there was a lot that was out of people's hands because of things like antiquated infrastructures at the state level and reducing the barriers, the types of authentication, and it was necessary. I'm not saying that it wasn't. We couldn't have the in-person verification because of public health and safety reasons, but that was what created this storm. The good news here is that when we get into some of the other scams and fraud that we're going to talk about, there are key things that consumers can do. You do have some control and you can make a difference. And I just want to throw in some of the reactions and some of the consequences of these crimes, just to build a better understanding of it. Now, this is just some trend data from our aftermath study. Every year, the ITRC does a study where we survey the folks that we helped in a previous year, and we do a very deep dive into what the impacts were on their lives, much more than just how much time did you spend and how much money did you lose. We ask about the emotional, the behavioral, and even the physical impacts. The full report will be out in May. It is free to the public. You can come to our website and get it when it's released. But one of the things that we saw this year that was particularly troubling, two key takeaways: re-victimization rates, they increased. In our previous year, 21% of our respondents had reported that they had been a previous victim of an identity crime. And this round, it was 28%. So that's a pretty big jump. And the other one was the increase in suicidal thoughts and feelings. Now, there's always been a small percentage of folks that have felt that way, but this was the first year that it reached double digits. We had a full 10% of our respondents reporting that at some point through resolving their case, they felt suicidal. And I think it's important to realize that this particular crime can have a huge effect, as significant as a violent crime in some cases, and it's not nothing to go through this. So good information to understand whether you are when you're dealing with victims, if you feel like they're overreacting, or if you yourself go through this experience and start criticizing yourself and say, am I overreacting? No, it's a big deal. It's a traumatic life experience. So we don't need to judge those reactions. You know, give yourself, and if you're serving people, give them a break. It can be a very traumatic experience. Okay, now on to the stuff that, now that you've got that foundation, on to the stuff. What are the attacks? How can you spot them, and what can you do about it? I want to spend some time on phishing and uh, business email compromise. So phishing, for those of you that don't know, it's the fraudulent practice of sending emails that are purporting to be from someone else, either a reputable company, someone else you trust, maybe a government agency, and it's all in order to induce you into revealing your data, your PII, or your money, or to get you to part with that money, maybe even to infect your computer, which is a first step in getting access to your data. And they're really on the rise, and they are increasingly leading to ransomware attacks. Here are just a few examples of some phishing emails that actually came into us. These are real emails. I want to make it very clear that the best practice is just to not engage. If you want to reduce your risk to zero, you just don't engage at all. But we realize that's somewhat impractical. So here are some of the easy ones. If you look at the top section, let's look at the one that says from services@amazon.com, but then you look at the actual email. That's not coming from Amazon. And all of these are like this, where you can see it. It says in the header it's from Amazon, but then it's got this really wonky and weird return email address. That's a phish, and you can just discard that immediately. Again, I don't want to give you a false sense of security that if that header doesn't have that automatically that means it's legitimate, because some of the thieves are very sophisticated. If you're unsure, don't guess. Now, if you see this, you see something where the headers don't match, then you can just say, okay, I know 100% that's a phishing email. But if you're unsure, don't guess and just say, hey, I'll roll the dice, because you could really create a lot of problems for yourself. If you did not initiate the contact, then go back to the source. Don't click on any links, don't log in, go to the known website, go to your known account and go to the source and verify that they are trying to get in touch with you. Now let's talk about some of the current scams, what they look like. This is a pretty scam savvy group based on those poll responses, so I won't go into a lot of detail here. We've got romance scams, where the scammers, the bad actors, are setting up fake dating profiles. Some of the red flags that you can look for there is that they will respond almost immediately. They will build a relationship very, very quickly. And in a short period of time, they will start asking for money, whether it's for, I need a plane ticket to come out and see you, or I've got something going on with my business and I need a loan. There could be just a whole panoply of reasons why, but those are some of the red flags. Then of course there's just general phone scams where callers will pretend to know you or pose as a trusted entity. It can be a charity organization, a financial institution, retailers, government agencies. At the end of the day, what they're going to do is try to use the trust that they're building, that they're trying to get from being aligned with those other organizations, and get you to part with your money. Then there's the grandparent scam. Sounds like just what it is. Callers pretend to be a relative in financial distress, and then there's always going to be a request for money. And prize and grant scams. Now the prize scams have relatively stayed the same. You've won the lottery. What I always tell people is, yes, there are legitimate sweepstakes out there, and there are legitimate, state lotteries. But I always ask people, how did you win if you didn't buy a ticket? Did you actually buy a ticket? That's your first clue. And then the other one is, look, you will have to pay taxes on prize winnings, but that is paid out of the winnings. You're never required to pay it up front and pay fees, and you're certainly not going to be required to pay them in the form of things like gift cards. Now, one of the things that scams have in common, if you look at the anatomy of a scam, there are some commonalities there. And I think of them this way: trust, confusion, and urgency. They're going to try to build trust with you in some manner, whether it's pretending to be in a romantic relationship with you, pretending to be a trusted entity, pretending to be a relative in distress. There's always that, I'm going to try to build trust with you. Then there's some confusion. This is particularly the case in the grant scams right now, because we do know that there are a lot of legitimate grants out there, and the bad actors are using that to confuse people. You can qualify now for a grant to go back to school because of the pandemic. Now, there are scholarships in those types of programs, but the federal government isn't paying for anyone to simply just enroll in school and go back to school as part of the COVID relief package. So there's always a confusion of process, and then they create a sense of urgency. You must do this right now. You either, because you're going to miss out on something, you have to pay the taxes on your sweepstakes winnings, or we're not going to give you the money, or fear of some kind of consequences. You owe these back taxes or these fees, and if you don't pay them, we're going to arrest you. So think of those things. If you encounter these things and you start feeling this building trust, creating confusion, creating a sense of urgency, those are huge red flags that this is a scam. And here are those avoiding scam tips. You're going to see these in Andy's presentation as well, because we really want to make sure that we give you a lot of resources. If you didn't initiate the contacts, and this applies across the board, phishing, phone call, text message, if you didn't initiate that contact, do not provide any information to that person. As far as automated calls, you really don't need to stay on the line. In fact, if you don't recognize the number, you don't need to answer that call. The depositing, and if you receive a check and then you're told to wire a portion of it back, I guarantee you that's a scam, because the check is no good, and by the time you find out, you will have sent part of that money back to the scammer, and you will be liable for that bad check. Most legitimate businesses and certainly government agencies are never going to ask you to pay with things like prepaid cards or gift cards. The IRS is not going to ask you to pay back taxes with iTunes gift cards. Please don't trust caller ID. It can be so easily spoofed. It is all but useless now. So don't trust it. Just because when you see the caller ID says IRS, it does not mean it's the IRS. And again, I go back to, when you're in doubt, if you did not initiate the contact, go back to the source. Now let's talk broadly about what you can do to protect your identity, to minimize your risk, and to understand what those pieces are and how you have to treat them. What are some broad things that you can do to really give yourself a good base of protection? One of the best things you can do is please strengthen your password. Please upgrade your password. I know that we all have a lot of accounts online, but one password per account, one unique password per account. The thieves know it's human behavior. We get, I don't want to say lazy, but it's hard to remember all of these things. And so we will overuse and reuse the same easy password over multiple accounts. So when there's a data breach of an account that you think, oh, that's not a big deal, it's my magazine subscription login, that's not a big deal, what are they going to do with it? Well, they know that you use that username and password across multiple accounts, and they will then take that data and try to get into other more lucrative or more sensitive accounts. And yeah, use a password manager. We don't endorse any particular one, but there are some good ones out there, and if they're intuitive and useful, go ahead and use them. And the whole thing about changing your passwords frequently, actually, if you use a long password, 12 characters or more, and it can be something that's meaningful to you, a book, a movie quote, something like that, then you don't have to change it as frequently, makes it easier for you to remember, so it's memorable to you. And the only time you really have to change it is if you do know that there's been a compromise, a data breach, or something like that. Multi-factor authentication, MFA. Some of you may know what this is, but I guarantee all of you have encountered it at some point. And this is where you try to log on to, let's say, your bank account. And maybe you're using a new device, and you will get that notification that says, hey, you're using a new device. We're going to send a code to another known either device or to your email so that we can really, it's an extra layer of authentication. We're really going to make sure that this is you. That's multi-factor authentication. And the thing is, it's widely available, and it is a great way to add that layer of protection for yourself. Generally speaking, it's opt-in, because businesses don't want to inconvenience us too much. But I'm going to encourage you to opt in anywhere you can, because again, it's not that inconvenient. It's a few seconds. Those codes come right away. And if somehow a thief has access to your username and password, if they don't have your phone or they don't have access to your email, they can't get that code and they can't actually get into the account. It's a great proactive step to take. And then device protection. Remember, your phone, it's not a phone, it's a computer. We've gotten really good about adding antivirus and malware detection software to our desktops and our laptops, but remember, phones can be infected too. And please add a PIN or a biometric lock to your devices. The Find Your Phone is a great option, and it's available in both platforms. And that way, if your phone is lost or stolen, you know where it is, and you can reset the device. If it's stolen and you can't get access to it, you can reset that device and take all of your data off there. Last thing I'll say on this is please apply software updates as soon as they come out. And that's not just to things like Microsoft, it is to the upgrading the versions on your phone. Those patches come out because the platform, the owners of those platforms, those companies realize that there are vulnerabilities. These are known vulnerabilities that they are trying to address. So it becomes this race. As soon as they put out the patches, the thieves now know what those known vulnerabilities are, and they are just hoping that they will have time to exploit them, because we're just going to go, I'm too busy, I'll do that later. So please apply patches and do software updates as soon as you are notified that they're available. It only takes a few minutes. Your behavior on social media, I mean, newsflash, folks, we overshare. And we can self-compromise our information, and sometimes we don't think it's that big of a deal, but the more, again, that puzzle, the more pieces of that puzzle that you give to folks that you don't know or you don't know very well, the easier it's going to be for them to pretend to be you. It can also create some vulnerabilities for scams. So if you're talking about a medical diagnosis or an ailment that you have, that's a great clue into what kind of scam might be really meaningful to you. And yes, they are doing this. They are looking at those bad actors are looking at all of that data. And please don't rely on the default privacy settings. The default settings are open to the world. So I always encourage everyone to go into the settings, set them to the most privacy centric that you're comfortable with, and understand it's not one and done. Those settings and those can be changed, and those terms and conditions can be changed as long as you're notified. So make sure that you just sort of if you're a user, put it on your list of things that you need to do every 6 months or so to make sure that it's set to where you want it and you understand who you're sharing your information with, how frequently, and those types of things. We've talked a lot about online, but there are still some things in real life. And there are still these analog types of crimes. So things like securing your personal documents, using a mailbox with a lock, particularly important if if you're in either a rural community where your mailbox is not close to your home, or in a high traffic community where you just have a lot of foot traffic. And then folks, please clean out your purse or your wallet. You don't need to carry your social security card. You don't need to carry all of those things in your purse if you're not using them that day. And then shred documents with your PII, because again, there is still things like mail theft. There are dumpster divers. Those things still happen. They're not as prevalent as the online stuff, but they do still occur. We get those cases into the call center every day. And then just a couple other proactive steps. Please freeze your credit. It is one of the most robust consumer protection steps that you can take, and you get a lot of bang for your buck with this one. It's not a panacea. It doesn't stop every type of identity theft, and it certainly doesn't guarantee 100% that this won't happen to you. But it takes a lot of your risk. It reduces a lot of your risk, and it's free. It is free for you, and it is free for your kids. You can do it for your kids. There are a few more hoops you have to jump through with your kids, because not only do you have to provide their identity credentials, you also have to demonstrate that you are the adult that has the legal authority to make those decisions for them. But it's really worth it, and it doesn't take that long. And it doesn't take that long to unfreeze it when you're seeking new lines of credit. So it's one of our biggest tips, and hardly anybody's doing it. Even though it became free a couple of years ago, it still doesn't have a lot of pickup. So we're asking folks to go ahead and freeze their credit. It's a great step. And very last thing, ask for help. Look, this is a complicated space. I've been in the fraud space for over 30 years. And sometimes folks feel like I should know this. I should be able to take care of this myself or manage this myself. This is not knowing if something is a scam or not knowing how these systems work. It is not something to be embarrassed or ashamed of. We have experts in all walks of life. If you fell down the stairs and broke your leg, no one else would say you should manage that, take care of that yourself. And you certainly wouldn't tell yourself that. You would go to a doctor and you would get help, and you would get a cast, and you would get medical care. It's the same thing. If you need help, ask for it. There's so many free resources. Of course, you can come to us at the ITRC. The Federal Trade Commission has amazing free resources. Look at all of those amazing fact sheets from Consumer Action. You don't have to go this alone. And with that, I'm going to turn it back over to Linda.
Great, Eva. Thank you for that very informative presentation. You really took us to school there. Now, although identity theft has been a feature of financial markets for as long as alternatives have existed to cash transactions, rarely do we hear about fraud and identity theft from a banker's perspective. That's changing today. So without further ado, let me turn you over to Andy. Andy, take it away. You have control.
Linda, that's terrific. I appreciate it. And Eva, thank you for your presentation. It's always fun being the fraud business and actually the banking business for about 35 years to hear the perspective of a real true consumer advocate. And one of the things that struck me when you were speaking, and then in preparation for my part of this, is that this is complex, right? I mean, how many pages do you have that talked about the different types of MOs that fraudsters engage in? And how many different ways do you have to protect yourself? And so to your point, I think it's important that we all know that it is complex, and there's nothing to be embarrassed about when this does happen. And it's okay to ask for help, because there's plenty of resources to be able to help. But from an industry view, the interesting part about fraud is that it's not only complex, but it's everywhere. From a dollar perspective, on the next page here, you'll see, actually, I'll cover that in 1 second, get back to my notes. But the dollar perspective, the amount of fraud that's out there is just crazy. But the fraud actors are becoming increasingly more sophisticated. I mean, I'm old enough to remember the days when the biggest thing we had to worry about with fraud was a teenage boy counterfeiting, cards in his room, or checks that were being counterfeited, kind of like the catch me if you can MO. But a lot of counterfeit card risk was mitigated with the advent of the chips on your debit and credit cards, though a lot of the counterfeit checks still plague banks today. But fraud's more sophisticated today. I mean, fraud organizations that we know of are more like global conglomerates. There's call centers with local management teams and success metrics and personal performance measures. I mean, they're run like, big businesses. And we have to worry about state-sponsored fraud cells, domestic fraud cells, local gang networks, and we have to still worry about the teenage boy that's in his house using stolen card numbers to buy games or items of value with Game Online. And so it's just so much more complex and is going to continue to get more complex. But the other part of this is that it's not only complex, but consumers are demanding that their money move at a faster pace, and they have more ways to make it so. And certainly some of the big tech companies have made that more simple. So rightfully so, the convenience of cash is what we're seeking without cash actually in our wallets. I mean, personally, I love, person-to-person money movement like Zelle or Venmo or Apple Pay. They're really great features. I love to be able to store my payment device in a digital wallet so I don't have to worry about the payment. And I like it when my printer orders my ink and I don't have to monkey around with whether or not my printer needs ink. I mean, just as an example. I like pulling to Chick-fil-A and paying with my phone instead of handing somebody my card and having it disappear over a counter. But with these new inconveniences that come with this consumer in mind first, they kind of come with fraud in mind afterwards. So Eva mentioned unemployment fraud, great example, right? Things were moving fast, funds had to get out quickly, but then the states in this case were very slow to move with good fraud controls to ensure that that could be done safely. And so the amount lost with the states has been just huge. So the new fraud controls deploy then at a slower stride than the money movement innovations themselves. And as a result, the banks sometimes have to catch up, just like the states are right now, to fraud actors rather than be ahead of them. And honestly, when fraud actors have 24 hours a day to find inherent weaknesses in fraud control systems, they'll eventually find them, even if the weaknesses are not at the bank. So just to give you a sense for the industry and how things look today, from to orient you to this slide, the top is really the fraud losses in the world by dollar amount, and then below it's by percentage of fraud. So if you look at the top fraud losses in the world, they're really from ATM machines. Well, that makes sense. That's where the money is, right? But how do the fraud actors take advantage of ATM machines? Well, historically, it's been through ATM skimming. And you may or may not be familiar with that, but that little mag stripe that's on the back of every one of your cards that runs from one end to the next, where we used to be a swipe reader, that's a very vulnerable type of authentication of that card. And the bad guys figured out a long time ago, if I can just read that at the time with a little device that sits on top of or inside of or with malware, that point of sale reader, and then put a camera on that keypad, I can actually get the PIN number as well as the magnetic media in the card itself, and then I can just make a new card, which they're still doing that from an ATM perspective, though some of that's starting to dry up. A lot of ATMs have gone to EMV readers. The second one you see there are those grocery stores by dollar amount. Well, who would have thought of that? Well, there's probably lots of reasons for this, but primarily, especially with COVID, this is in the age of COVID, grocery shopping is undergoing a significant change where customers are ordering groceries online and they're having them delivered, or they're buying them online and going and picking them up, but it's still an online transaction. So it's gone from a point of sale transaction to a transaction in the cloud, which is where the payment security is weaker than a store. But then also at grocery stores, you sell prepaid and gift cards. So that has a lot to do with it too. Those are easily convertible into different types of, basically it's dollars. Money-related services like person-to-person, I mentioned a minute ago, Bitcoin scams, they fall into this next category. Again, it's where the money is. And the last two top dollar categories there you see in the top can be translated easily into cash. So computers, televisions, jewelry, hard currency, convertible goods. So due to lockdown and social distancing requirements, also consumers are working from home and otherwise homebound look for electronics for connection, communication, entertainment, and so forth. So the purchases of those types of goods actually increased 16% globally, but the fraud rate increased 72% globally, again, all online purchases. And then at the bottom, you see the comparison by the percentage of fraud, which is kind of interesting. So subscription fraud shows up as the top dog there. And with this, there's lots of underneath this, but I like to look at the telecommunications fraud, where fraud actors use their own or stolen or what we call synthetic ID, which is kind of a made up person, to obtain mobile devices and services with no intention to pay. And also where that same device can be used as a trusted device for establishing banking accounts. Real estate rental, very interesting. Yeah, Eva mentioned that a little bit. I've recently seen cases where, like with VRBO and Airbnb, where the bad actors, they target these companies with fake properties. So they're on the property side, they're on the renter side, and then where the fake renters receive proceeds from the fake renters who have the stolen devices. So owning both the merchant side and the buyer side of any equation will make fraud easier to get away with. Then you got, again, money transfer, same thing, Zelle, Venmo, cryptocurrencies. And then the last one, last two, digital media and advertising services. Think about the money that changed hands with Google, as an example. Google's actually finding itself being a pretty big victim lately because of their method for validating accounts. Bad actors are after some of the micro deposits that they send out by the tens of thousands each day. And for small amounts, but it's death by 1,000 cuts, they can certainly get a lot of money extracted out of that. So that's an example of some of the top types of fraud drivers. And what I wanted to cover next is, from a banker's point of view, we have to worry about the bad guy, right? We always have to worry about that fraud actor. But the first type of fraud, actually, I would say, sadly, these days are, particularly in the US, our culture doesn't seem to have a problem with stealing from the bank. And there's probably lots of reasons for that. But the idea of justifying crime is something that we're seeing entirely too much of with things like, claims abuse, filing claims when it's not really a claim at all. You're just doing it to be able to, the consumer's doing it to be able to extract dollars out of it, or to be able to somehow justify getting money that they think they deserve. But also when the financial condition of the customer is dire. And let's face it, COVID has made that the case. They sometimes do the unthinkable, steal the proverbial loaf of bread. We refer to this as first-party fraud. Complicit customer fraud and customers being enticed to provide their own account information. So Eva talked a lot about keep the information safe. And I'm going to say the same things in a second to enforce that. But in some cases, the customer intentionally gives away their information or their PII for the promise of money or some other type of value. And this type of fraud is in the rise. The fraudulent submission of claims, and I mentioned also disputes, just not even fraudulent disputes, but that wasn't my transaction, or I don't like this type of thing. That's actually continuing to go up at banks right now. But then also the plain old fashioned true customer fraud, which is that's the person, they open the account with the intent of defrauding the bank. In this case, likely because they believe there's no consequences for doing so. But this is really hard for banks, and not to have a pity party for banks, but it is hard to detect. When you have to look at we have to trust our customers, just like our customers trust us. And we have to believe that every customer out there it certainly deserves the type of service that we can provide. But if we can't trust any of our customers, then we can't really effectively operate as a bank. So we really have to spend a lot of time separating the wheat from the chaff, so to speak, or like I like to put it, the grain of arsenic inside of the salt in the salt shaker. We really have to work hard to ensure that we're identifying the fraud. Some of the tools Eva mentioned were velocity, where we do watch behaviors, and if there's something that's outside of your regular spend pattern, we'll likely give you a text and say, hey, was that your transaction? That's the reason we do that. We're not trying to be nosy, just trying to make sure that is the right transaction, that is your transaction. I know that where I bank in one of my other banks, I end up, getting these interesting, are you traveling notices? Or they ask me the question, are you traveling right now? Because I have a transaction outside of the area. That's a good proactive way to be able to make sure that we're protecting the customer. From the literal bad guy perspective, this is what we call third-party fraud over in our world. So this is the typical fraud actor fraud. Someone you don't know, never heard of, but you may have talked to, maybe not. It's really where Eva spent a lot of her presentation time. This is the type of fraud where you can best help yourself, quite frankly. And trust me when I say, as Eva really emphasized, the fraud community already has your data, whether it was an Equifax breach or an IRS breach or a Hartman breach. I've seen lots of information on the dark web, where, much like we saw in Eva's presentation, you have various price points for certain types of data. I've seen dark websites that show name, address, social security number, driver's license number, sign-on credentials, passwords, as well as your current bank balance. And that type of information is out there so long as there is somebody that's pushing a button allowing malware to be able to take place on their phone or on their computers or on their phones. And this is the kind of value that's in where the bad guys are at and trying to do account takeovers and ID theft just waiting to happen. But also trust me when I say that fraud actors usually need just a little more information to carry out identity theft related transactions or taking over your accounts. Like PINs, one-time passwords. That second line of defense or other providers set up, they need that from you. And so the question is, then where do they get it? Well, they get it from you, generally. Social media, they get it from you by phone, by email. They've got a really good story, and they're very good at extracting it. They ask you for it, and they get it from you. And it's because they look like someone who you trust is contacting you. They look like your bank, they look like a company, they look like your relative, they look like your friend. And this type of information extraction is, for us, is called social engineering. And the actors are so good at it that we're often amazed that they are able to do that. And especially with the vulnerable populations, like elderly, for an example. The grandparent scheme, my father was a victim of a grandparent scheme. My son reportedly was arrested for a DUI and needed to be bailed out. He was about to hit that little button and send $5,000 the way of the bad guy. So it happens to even those who are the parents of a fraud executive. So from a banker perspective, the question I get most frequently, and you've heard all this, but I am going to say a lot of it, some of it's repeat, but I have kind of a top 10 list on how can I protect myself. And forgive if some of these are overlapping, but it's not just the help that I'm calling for, but I'm also kind of calling for helping your bank help you, right? The bank is not just helping itself, but the bank, in the case of scams, the liability tends to reside more with the customer, the consumer, than with the bank. And the bank certainly can't help you, but not without you helping drive that help yourself. So the last page that I'll cover with you today is really just these 10 things, and hopefully these are meaningful to you. And I put them in a little bit lighthearted of terms so that you can kind of help remember these things to protect yourself. The first one is don't call me, I'll call you. Unless someone is calling on a number that you really trust, you've looked it up yourself, and actually don't trust the other person on the phone. If I was to say one thing that I could talk to the entire country all at the same time, it's stop sharing your passwords or one-time passwords with people who call you. And it sounds intuitive, but it happens all the time. especially one-time passwords. It looks like the bank is calling you, they're asking you for the numbers, and you ignore that little sign on the text itself that says, do not share this with anybody, including us. So that's the one thing. If you're not calling them, then don't trust them. Wait, don't push that button. I'm probably a little more conservative even than Eva is on this. To me, email links are evil. So the most common extraction methods for scams. As an example, I've seen many people lose their life savings on mortgage transactions. Let me say that again. Their life savings on a mortgage transaction. Well, malware is on their home computer or the title company's computer. And the fraud actor watching the transaction transpire on the appointed day basically sends an email over that looks like the title company to change the funding instructions to themselves. So if an email interests you, don't put that fraud actor in the driver's seat by letting them be on your computer in the first place, right? Go outside of the email unless you're really well educated on knowing the difference and also of the discipline to be able to look at the actual URL and avoid the malware in the first place. Even the example that Eva gave, if Amazon contacting you saying your account's locked, get out of the email, don't push any buttons, go to Amazon and check to see if you're locked out. I think you'll find you're not. The next one is run faster than the bear. Fraud actors, they come up with new MOs and different cyber malware. The tech companies will release new security updates and they will generally defeat it fairly quickly once they know about it. But if you don't keep your updates current, you're missing out on that mitigation. So run faster than the bear and keep all of your phone and your computer updates current. Also keep your antivirus current as well. Bring out your creative side. Yeah, so password creativity, really important. My dog had 56 puppies, exclamation mark, starting out with a hashtag. I mean, just something to be able to remind yourself and to Eva's point, vary it up from password to password. And that's really important. And also, if your bank does offer a persistent multi-factor authentication, like a one-time password every time you sign in, sign up for that. Multi-factor authentication, so that one-time password or something like it to your phone, a second device, that is always a really strong way to be able to deter the fraudsters from getting into your accounts, especially if you are vigilant about not sharing that information ever. Verify and don't trust. This is closely linked to number one. They're literally apps that you can go into the App Store right now and you can download it, and I can call you and I can say I'm Bank of America. And it's under the caption of those websites of fool your friends. And then the app description says, it's like, yeah. So never trust caller ID as has been articulated already. Stop, freeze. I would say, I completely agree with Eva in this again. Manage your own credit. Freezing yours, and I'm gonna emphasize children's credit bureaus too. We see way too many cases of children's Social Security information, PIA, being compromised by the establishment of a synthetic ID, so using their ID plus other types of information, and the child, they are compromised by the time they get to 18, they didn't even know it, and then they have to start this process of trying to fix the problem. So anyway, freeze your children's or grandchildren's, whatever the case may be too. I strongly encourage you to do that. You must not act now. Slow down the game. If somebody's pressing you to move quickly, slow down the game. Don't do it. Don't fall for it. If you're uncomfortable, just slow it down. Verify it. Outsmart the fraud process. Bet with chips. You don't always have a choice here, but don't swipe your card anymore. That mag stripe information is so easily compromised. If you're even to the point where, think about the merchants that are still having you do any type of swiping, know that that is eventually not going to be good for you in trying to secure your information. This is the next one is, feel lonely, get a dog. It's actually, loneliness is a horrific vulnerability. And this is not to make light of it, but just something to remember it by. People who are lonely are very susceptible to romance scams, friendly fraud, which is your relatives, and elder abuse fraud as well. So, reach out to lonely people, and well beyond a dog, the human touch has much value. prevent loneliness, and especially if you know somebody who is, especially in the days of lockdowns and isolation. We need to get out of this rut together. And so we have to reach out to people. The last one is know the game. Keep up with your bank's website and other services that were mentioned earlier. Educate yourself on the latest trends. So not only how to protect myself, but know what the bad guys are doing too. An educated consumer is their own best friend, and knowing fraud methods will help you avoid the fraud and then also not be a victim. The last thing I would say is that consumer and banks together are losing just billions of dollars. And I see it, and it's a tragedy each and every day. Banks and government entities and businesses are all relying on the customer, ironically, to help themselves. And then the customer is relying on banks and government entities and businesses to protect them. And we're all doing the right thing. But the truth is, all parties have to play the role and have to play the role effectively. And the more we can play together, the more effective the war being waged against fraud will be. But the other truth is that nobody can protect you better than you. And so hopefully I've been able to get that point across with the top 10 here. It's protecting yourself is imperative. So that's all I had today. I appreciate the opportunity to be able to share. And Linda, I will give it back to you.
Thank you, Andy. And I'm telling you now, I'm going to use that phrase, run faster than the bear. I hope everyone is taking down the 10 ways that you can protect yourself and share that information with your clients. I know there's a ton of questions out there, so I'm going to turn the presentation over to my coworker, Nelson Santiago. And I know you have questions. Type those questions in now so Nelson can get them. Nelson, are you ready? I know you have tons of questions.
Yes, Linda, thank you, Eva and Andy, for the great presentation. There are lots of questions, so let's jump right into them. Somebody is asking, how do you remove a personal account, all the information out there, contact information on the various website directory sites? It seems like those directory sites have everything about you, age, where you've lived, your relatives. Are there any best practices there?
Well, I can jump into that one, Nelson, and that is a real challenge. And the challenge is that many of these are public records, and so you don't have any kind of private right of action. They aren't necessarily breaking the law. I mean, some of the fraudulent ones are. And so what they do is they have a process for you to remove that information, and you have to avail yourself of the process. Sometimes it's buried and hard to find. And if you find one in particular, like Spokio's one of them, and you want to remove your information, if you can't find where the process is, you can certainly reach out. I'm sure Consumer Action has some information on that. We at ITRC certainly do. But the reality is you have to go through each one and follow their process, and it can be tedious. So this is just part of the world that we live in, and trying to limit our personal information. So you can knock them down one at a time. Andy, did you have anything to add to that?
Yeah, I think the only thing I completely agree with you. You have to play by the rules of wherever that posting may occur. I would only add one thing, which is I think about maybe not a direct example, but a good example is bureaus. Make sure you do keep an eye on your bureau information. We know of a lot of cases where fraud actors have gotten a hold of your bureau information and then filed a dispute on a bureau, and then suddenly we find ourselves having on the bank side having to recall a report of bureau credit, whether it's good or bad, and then they use that information to be able to set up credit someplace else. Make sure that you understand what's happening with your bureau. Check your bureaus, and then if you do have any type of information that's not correct in your bureaus, they do have good processes to be able to have disputes on your bureau information, and they're required by law to be able to uphold those.
Oh, that's such a great tip. And I just want to piggyback on that. Before you freeze your credit, folks, you should go ahead and read those credit reports and make sure that there isn't anything fraudulent on there, and so that you can detect it and make sure that there aren't any errors. And right now it is free once a week. I don't know if that's going to be extended, Historically, you can get one report from each bureau on an annual basis from annualcreditreport.com, but right now you can get them on a more frequent basis, so take advantage of that.
Great, thank you both. And Andy, since you initially raised this issue of bureaus, a couple of people did ask during your presentation, tell us more about the fourth credit bureau that you mentioned. They're used to the three. Well, who's the fourth?
Yeah, this is Andy. I would say that the four bureaus are Equifax, TransUnion, Experian, and the one that people rarely know anything about, it's Innovis or Innovis. I'm not sure exactly what the pronunciation is, but those are the four. And if you look up all four, you'll have the chance of being able to put freezes on all four of those.
Great, thank you. And also related to putting information out there, somebody is asking, is there identity theft? Have you heard of identity theft situations related to the DNA testing? If somebody's interested in doing those ancestry tests, should they be wary somehow related to this topic of identity theft?
That's a really interesting question, and it's all about how much information you're willing to provide and share to different platforms. It really depends on what data you're providing. In and of itself, your DNA is not currently used to authenticate you. So those types of things aren't necessarily going to increase your risk, just that one data point. But what it speaks to is the larger thought process about how much information am I going to share and put out there, and what is the return on that? And that's a very personal choice. So something like getting your DNA done, that can be a personal choice because maybe you do want to know history of certain medical conditions. I would really be wary of reading those terms and conditions, reading the privacy policy of any organization that you're going to entrust with that information, and making sure that it's not being shared in a way that you're not comfortable with and not being publicly shared. So another example I can give is that, like those quizzes where what kind of spirit animal are you? You're answering a lot of questions and giving out a lot of information about yourself to an unknown entity just to get a result that really isn't going to change your life or be that useful. So when you're thinking about these things, really weigh what is the benefit that I'm getting from getting this information about myself versus how much am I giving up to get it. And again, I think for the case of the DNA tests, really read those terms and conditions and those privacy policies to make sure that you understand how your data is being housed and shared and stored and all of those things.
Yeah, Eva, I think that's a great response. And I would only add that you can look no further than the recent past to gauge what could happen in the near-term future. So when I think about the giveaway of data on a DNA test, I look back at social media in its early beginnings, where we were just basically having cool conversations and sharing information with our friends. And then before you know it, it explodes. And now the information that's on social media is being used in rather nefarious ways these days. And so then the question for me is, well, gee, how does the data about my very being get used in a way that could be nefarious in the future? And so again, for me, everything is a risk factor. For me, it is a personal decision, but for me, it's a risk that I personally was unwilling to take. But I know a lot of people do feel like the benefit is worth it, but you have to understand the risks and weigh them.
Great, thank you. And maybe terms and conditions are relevant here too with this next question about those various financial apps that connect your bank information, your asset information to the app. Are there, how safe are those? Any thoughts on that?
Well, we can't make a blanket statement about that because there are some legitimate ones that can provide you with a benefit and that can give you information that can be really useful for your financial health. Again, it's about making sure that you're using a legitimate app and reading those terms and conditions. As long as Andy's sharing his personal sentiment, I am not comfortable with sharing that information. I choose to do it in another manner, one that I know can't be breached. And that's things like good old fashioned pen and paper. But I'm hyper vigilant, and so some of those apps can have value. So it really does become a personal choice. I think the biggest risk that you have is going to an unknown provider, an unknown app that's relatively new on the market where you truly don't know, because look, there are scam apps in the app stores. They try to police that, but some of them get through. And just saying, oh, this looks like a handy tool, I think I'll share all this information without doing your homework, that's really dangerous. Even if you do think you're going to get a good reward at the end, because it's going to give you the tools that you need for financial management, you really have to know who, and this is something you can apply broadly. Please, 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 before you share that kind of PII, that kind of very sensitive personal information, know who you're sharing it with. There are legitimate reasons to share it. There are sometimes you have to. I mean, when you go to freeze your credit reports, you have to share your social security number with the bureau because they have to authenticate you. That is a legitimate use, and it's understandable. And you know that you're dealing with Equifax, Experian, or TransUnion. It's very different in the App Store. You don't actually know who you're dealing with unless it's something that's established, that has been around for a long time, and you know that that's a legitimate service provider.
Yeah, and silly me, I tend to trust banks more than some new app or a new fintech type of capability. And so a lot of banks have aggregator services that are being described, and I'll trust that. To give my bank that has a lot of my money access, even though they use a third-party service as well, to other types of PII, including my sign-on password at another institution. I'll trust that only because I know that bank very well and I trust them enough to be able to keep my money there in the first place. But to ask me to do that at a random app store from to a developer that I don't know who it is and what they're up to, I personally wouldn't do that. I need to learn from Eva, I guess, about being more paper oriented, but nonetheless, I would trust a bank, but I definitely wouldn't, personally trust because there's too many trade-offs there. Anything else.
That, and you bring up a good point, Andy, and folks, this is something you should realize. Look, the banks and the credit bureaus are highly, highly regulated. How they store your information, how they share it, all of those things are under some very, very strict regulations and transparency and disclosure. There's a lot of requirements. A fintech, app developer company, while the general laws and regulations apply, they don't have that same level. So I can see why you're saying that, Andy. A bank, even the credit bureaus, a lot of them have those types of services. Your credit card issuer, they are highly regulated, and so that might be a better place to go if you don't have the the acumen to really do a deep dive and do your homework and make sure you're going with a legitimate app or service provider.
Yeah, amen to that. Most bankers and credit bureau employees have a regulator twitch that happens every couple of seconds. We are so under the microscope all the time that certainly it's a big part of what we do is obey the regulations, and they're there for a reason. It's to keep the consumer safe.
Great, thank you. And Consumer Action has done some work around fintech education, so periodically you'll get emails from us about some new tools around that. A couple of people mentioned about the weekly credit reports being available through April 22. That was something that was in the news just recently. So weekly reports will be available. They wanted to share that. And then a couple of people have been asking for a little more information on freezing. For example, there may be some myths out there. For example, someone's asking, how long should I keep my credit bureaus frozen? Or what are some key sources that you might want to mention?
Well, certainly you can look at the process varies from bureau to bureau, and you can look at each one. They have on their website what the process is and how it works and what you have to provide. As far as the length, I say indefinitely. So here's how it works. When you freeze your credit, you have basically stopped anyone including yourself, including the legitimate owner of those identity credentials and that credit profile, from opening new lines of accounts. It does not affect the entities that you have a current financial relationship with, but it stops anyone from opening a new financial account when it's frozen. But there's a process to thaw it. So if you find that I need to go buy a new car, I need to thaw my credit for that period of time. Some of the bureaus, you can actually say, I want to thaw it for 24 hours, and it will then automatically refreeze. Sometimes you have to, because it varies, you have to actively thaw it and then go back and say, now I want to refreeze it. Yes, it takes a few minutes, but not that much time. And it's just a matter of being a little bit organized when you know that you're in the market for applying for new lines of credit or new loans. So from a time period standpoint, I say, freeze it indefinitely and just thaw it when you need it, and then keep it frozen when you don't.
Yeah, I'm gonna, completely agree with that. And and in some cases, my banker saying that is heresy. Because there are also some limitations from the bank side on us being able to go out and query you and so forth that no, my product partners may not necessarily like, but as a risk person, it's really a good idea. I just simply ask myself, question, well, how often do you actually use your credit bureau? Well, you only use it when you're out there applying for new credit. Well, how often does that happen? Probably in most cases, for most of us, not very often. And so why leave that critical amount of information out there open and without password protection, without some way of being able to ensure that somebody else isn't tapping into it? To me, it's one of those things where you can control your own destiny, and you can control the destiny of your children or whoever else in your family that would make sense to lock their bureaus or freeze their bureaus. And it is simple. It's simple to put on. It's simple to take off. You can take it off for for whatever time period, 24 hours, 2 hours, whatever that you want to on most of the bureaus. And it's just simply a very, very good practice.
Excellent. I'll just ask a couple more questions since we are going over time now. Somebody's asking, just what is the best practice for saving usernames and passwords? Can password managers be hacked? Somebody else asked. So how do you keep that, all those tons of passwords that we have, safe?
Well, yes, password managers could be hacked. In fact, LastPass did have a data breach a couple of years ago, but it wasn't critical information that was breached. The passwords weren't actually breached. So you don't want to go into any interaction that you have with any platform thinking that it's impenetrable, because that's just not the case. However, they have, as a business model, they have a vested interest in keeping your information safe. And if there was a spate of insecurities on those password managers, they simply wouldn't be in the market. So, again, we don't endorse any particular one, but it's better to do something like that. When you look at risk, you have to think it's very hard to reduce your risk to zero. So you look at, how can I incrementally reduce it? I would certainly rather see someone using a password manager than using the same easy password across all of their accounts. You are at much greater risk if you're using, your dog's name, Fluffy 12, across all of your accounts. And then this is I'll commit heresy too here, Andy. Especially when I'm talking to my seniors who have said, I can't use a password manager, they're not intuitive. I'm not that internet savvy. I also now have gotten to the point where I am engaged enough online that I have accounts. So I have more than I can remember. How can I do this safely? And so I am going to say it's okay to write them down, but you have to do it the right way. And what I mean when I say write them down is, let's go old school, go back to good old fashioned pen and paper, and keep them in a secure location in your home, a locked drawer, in your filing cabinet, in your desk, something like that. Now, it's true, there's a risk there. Someone with access to that drawer, a family member, that it does happen. Caregivers and family members steal identities all the time. or your house could be broken into and burglarized and they could get access to that. Those are your risks. But again, that's a reduced risk from using the same password easy password over and over across the same accounts. You have a much greater risk there. And when I say write it down, I'm talking about pen and paper. Do not put it on a spreadsheet on your computer. Do not put it in a Word document on your computer. That is the same thing, almost the same thing as using the same easy password across all of your accounts. You've digitized it. And now if your computer gets a virus or gets hacked in some manner, you've put all your passwords out there. So if you're having a hard time managing your passwords, yes, a password manager can be a very useful tool. If that's not going to work for you, then pen and paper in a secure location is your next best bet. But by all means, please don't keep using the same easy password across all of your accounts. That's really where you create a lot of risk.
Excellent, thank you.
I was gonna say, does Andy want to jump on that one? Because I just committed heresy.
No, the heresy was okay. I was just going to say now I have however to go and change all my passwords because Fluffy 12 was pretty much it, and now I'm going to have to go work that out.
So real quick, maybe somebody wanted to know if one company's two-step verification system is as good as the others. How reliable are these? Are scammers finding a way around these? Can you trust these from most companies?
Yeah, I think that, multi-factor authentication is beginning to come in lots of different forms, right? We've got, selfie authentication, we have one-time passwords, we have other types of biometrics. I don't know that that one is better than the other, but I do know that the one that's the most vulnerable, it seems these days, is the one-time passcode. And I know that from a banking perspective, we're now sort of trying to look towards the future beyond passcodes in general. And the reason for that is because, it's so easy to be social engineered and fooled by these bad guys, even who call up and say, hey, I'm your bank and you got to trust me and you need to give me that number that I just sent over to you a minute ago. And so, it's what is most prevalent out there right now. And so the education point that I'm making is, trust the one-time passcode. It's okay to have that because it is the most prevalent and certainly the most easy right now. But then you have to keep it secure, no matter what company you're dealing with. Now, you start getting into things like, biometrics. Again, this is like going to the DNA sites. How much are you willing to put out there, even though it's not, putting your face in this grand database that uses data points? Nonetheless, those are decisions we'll have to make as that type of multi-factor authentication begins to proliferate.
Well, thank you so much, Eva and Andy. If we didn't get to your question, please get them to us. Both of our speakers have said they can help answer questions afterwards, and we can also try to find answers for you. So reach out to us. Thank you, Linda. I'll turn it over back to you to wrap up. Thank you again.
Thank you, Nelson, and Evelyn, Andy. Thank you so very much for your presentation and taking the time to answer the audience questions. It has really been a pleasure working with you both, and we will look for opportunities to work with you again. Thank you so much. I'm going to tell you a little bit about upcoming events. I've noticed that a few of you have not registered for our April 20th webinar on the adoption of contactless payments during COVID-19 pandemic. You don't want to miss this one. It is going to be a great webinar. We have 3 great speakers for you. If you haven't received the invite for that training, let me know, and I'll make sure you receive a VIP invite to that webinar. Watch your inbox for the invite for our May 11 webinar on the impact of COVID-19 on your retirement saving. That too is going to be a great webinar. Again, this webinar was presented as part of Consumer Action's COVID-19 education project with funding from Wells Fargo. And you can find all of the project information at our website, www.consumeraction.org/COVID-19. Now, on to the good part. If you're interested in contributing to Consumer Action, you can do so online by credit card, by going to our website, or you can mail us a check. Attention membership or giving at 57 Post Street, Suite 611, San Francisco. Again, a very special thanks to Eva and Andy for their dynamic presentation. And I would like to thank you for taking time out of your busy schedules to be with here today. At Consumer Action, our goal is to bring you good, relevant, and timely information so that you can use it to help your clients reach their financial goals. I trust that you gained some information that you can share today. I look forward to welcoming you back on April 20th for the webinar on the adoption of contactless payments. Again, if you didn't receive that invite, send me an email and I will make sure you receive a VIP invite. Thank you for all the work that you are doing. Stay safe and stay sane. Until next time, have a good rest of your day. Thank you. Goodbye.